Hello, I'm Jeff Gill, the instructor for Disciples of Christ History and Polity for Phillips Seminary through the Center for Ministry and Lay Training. And I trust that if you're watching this, you've already seen the introductory video where I kind of give you a bit of an orientation to my approach to the subject we're going to read, reflect on, and come to a better understanding of together, and had a look at the syllabus. But this is the lecture for week 1, along with the materials that you'll see there in the syllabus. And as I say there, again, it's a heavy load the first week. You may not quite get to everything requested, but please carry on as best you can. The first week is heavy. It does get lighter, and then it gets a little heavy again, and then it'll be reasonable right through the end, but we got to hit you with a bunch right here at the outset. So thank you for doing the reading and, of course, the interaction, which we'll share together on this Canvas platform as we talk to each other. But I hope these videos are useful. I could give you a text lecture, which you could read. That has certain advantages, I know, but I think this helps us continue to hold together the sense of a class and a shared experience that I'm hoping this facilitates and doesn't get in the way of. So as I said, I'm Jeff Gill. I'm in Ohio. I'm honored to be sharing and teaching with you. My backdrop for this week is the old Cane Ridge Church down in Kentucky, where so much of the history of our movement begins in 1801. The building was actually built about 10 years before that. Blue ash logs, and it's now inside, as I suspect you can see, a larger stone structure. My mother visited it with her parents. Her parents and grandparents were disciples when she was young, and she and my dad on their honeymoon in 1958 stopped by, and in between they had built the structure over the top of it, and she was quite taken aback. But there it is, the Cane Ridge Church still there, the site, the hub around which the Cane Ridge revival took place. And you'll run into that location in this church again and again in these first few weeks' readings. I want to step back, but also step forward into our current moment and reflect a bit in this initial lecture on, well, there's a subject when it comes to talking about and teaching history that I think gets much battered about and abused, and is worth us spending some time on as here in 2022, we talk about our own movement and its history and its polity. The term I have in mind is decentering. And decentering perhaps has become most well known as an outgrowth of the publicity around the 1619 Project, which was published by the New York Times, has gotten a certain amount of play around the country, and some have embraced it and some have chosen to reject it. But what the 1619 Project is trying to do, really, at essence, is to decenter things and look at how the picture changes depending on where you stand. And in a different sort of way, I think I've been talking and teaching and lecturing about decentering for many years. With a different sort of example, I'll say to people who are asking, why are you so interested in that perspective, or changing our assumptions from where they've been to this new set of assumptions? And I like to draw attention to the example of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, you know, my dad, and he's passed along to me, I'm as interested as I guess a lot of men are in Civil War history. And when we were young, we visited the battlefield, and I know there are dozens, no, hundreds of books about Gettysburg, and even a relatively small library might have a shelf full all about that one battle, 3 days in July, 1863. But here's the thing, you can have a story of how the battle unfolds, how it started and how it ended from the Northern or the Union point of view, or you could write it from the Southern, the Confederate perspective. You can talk about the battle purely in the Olympian view of the generals, kind of the overview, and talk all about strategy and tactics. Or, as a friend of mine once said, the Battle of Gettysburg is really best understood from the point of view of lieutenants and captains taking initiative, sometimes wisely, sometimes less so. For many years, the center, the hub of thinking about the Battle of Gettysburg was Pickett's Charge, the third day. But after a movie came out a few decades ago, thank you, Ted Turner, rooted in a book that came out in the late 1970s, The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. And in it, he highlights a fellow named Joshua Chamberlain, not a soldier by background, but he commands men and he leads the 20th Maine. And on the second day at Little Round Top, although historians had known this for years, that the left edge of the left flank was kind of hanging out there in midair, and a Southern assault almost took it and could have conceivably rolled up the line. But after the movie Gettysburg, if you go again and again, as some of us do, to that battlefield, you see that Little Round Top and that southern edge of it, where the 20th Maine Memorial and markers are, suddenly have gotten a whole lot more traffic, a whole lot more attention. That element of the battle has become recentered. How you understand the Battle of Gettysburg depends an awful lot about what your center or centers, your perspectives are. The 1619 Project, I think the controversy comes from the fact that they said, we can talk in 2019 about 400 years of representative democracy, because it's true that in the summer of 1619, the first elected assembly of representatives to govern that Jamestown colony in Virginia began something which we like to think of as continuing to this day. And so the center of that celebration and narrative is democracy. The 1619 Project said, but somewhere that week or a week before or a week after, African persons were sold into chattel slavery, just a few dozen feet away from the same building where that first representative democratic assembly took place. So is the story of America to be centered on the story of democracy and freedom? Or what happens if you look at the history of America and you center enslavement? You center stories of people like Angela, who we know very little about, but she was one of those first people, a person from Africa, sold into slavery. And as you work your way through the whole development of independence, the writing of the Constitution, and certainly up to and through the Civil War and down to the present day, the question of enslavement and ownership and human rights and privilege, well, American history looks different. You see things you wouldn't see if you just kept privileging and centering freedom and democracy as being the core of our story. So decentering, it's become controversial, but I think it's been something historians always have and should do. And even, well, the local historian, which a preacher or a pastor or a church leader is, I'm sure in theology classes, they talk about you being the local theologian. Well, you're also the local historian. And so to take you into the readings that you have for this week, and again, it's a truckload, I understand. But as you're introduced to our four founders, who tend to be the center, at least, of the first major section of Disciples' history, Barton Stone, there's his church, Thomas and Alexander Campbell, father and son, and then Walter Scott, the evangelist for that Mahoning Baptist Association that ends up becoming the heart of what we now call the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. The four founders tend to be the center. I just want to introduce to you quickly three figures who, if I were recentering our disciples' story, I might propose just as a thought experiment, just as an attempt to look at things from a different angle. There are three somewhat overlooked, slightly neglected, or perhaps even entirely unknown persons who might, by being centered, teach us something new and maybe even something more about who we are as disciples and how we're to keep working out that destiny and that vision that God intends that began, sure, with those four founders. But for we, well-known or nameless today, as we're working out what it means to be a Christian in the Disciples of Christ tradition, I want to recenter a bit and just toss out 3 very quick thumbnail descriptions of how I might decenter or recenter our history. The 3 names are David Purviance, Sarah Lou Bostic, and Myrtle Park Storm. David Purviance. Now, one of the things that I absolutely have to insist you read is the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. It is an outgrowth, an aftermath of the Cane Ridge revivals of 1801 and this group of mostly, but not entirely, Presbyterian preachers who seek a certain kind of independence of thought, of belief, and of practice, certainly including in who you serve communion to and being a little freer about it than the Presbyterianism of 1801 accepted. So into 1804, these folks come together to become kind of a new group, the Springfield Presbytery, but within months they realize, no, we don't quite want to replicate the old mistakes with a new coat of paint. We want to do something completely different. So please, very short document, very simple, but with quite an impact. Because the Springfield Presbytery, that group of pastors and churches, says that we're writing a last will because we intend to die as an organization and sink into the body of Christ. It's a beautiful phrase. And the interesting thing is, you'll note in the syllabus, in most references, it's last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, Barton Stone et alia. Well, that et al. Includes David Purviance, who very likely was in fact the person who really wrote the words, which Stone and some others signed. And after the last will and testament was signed, many of the others, well, they kind of went their own way. Quite a few of them became Shakers. And there's a whole set of interesting stories that branch out from there. And Stone has his time in the wilderness, but ultimately finds his path and starts publishing the Christian Messenger and ends up moving to Illinois. And so the story goes until his passing in 1844. We center Barton Stone because of, well, the Cane Ridge Church, the Cane Ridge Revival, and the fact that he published and he managed the discussion and the debate about what it means to become Christians and Christians only. But David Purviance never really wavered after that last will and testament was signed, the one that perhaps he wrote. In fact, long before Barton Stone decided that he didn't want to live in a slave state anymore, which is what Kentucky was in the first decades of the 1800s, this border state, though it was later, come the Civil War. But David Purviance says as early as 1807, I'm not going to do it. Barton Stone ends up owning slaves, not willingly. He didn't go out and purchase them, but he inherits them and he tries to do right by them. But David Purviance never owned slaves. And much more quickly than Barton Stone, he said, I'm getting out of here. I'm crossing the river. And he goes from the area of Paris, Kentucky, to a town he helps found and name New Paris, Ohio. If you go there, it's just north of US 40, Interstate 70. He's buried on the north edge of town. And the thing is, David Purviance has an amazing career, and there's a short, simple biography easily found online that his son Levi wrote. But the thing is, David Purviance didn't publish a periodical and didn't go the kind of leadership track that Barton Stone and the Campbells chose. He simply founded churches, preached for them, and very interestingly, both in Kentucky and in Ohio, he saw the need for a voice for abolition and for justice and equal rights for free Blacks in both states, long before abolitionism was, well, you can't say cool, but at least more common. David Purviance spoke up on behalf of African Americans whose rights were being violated, free or enslaved. And he did so at no small personal cost. And he did so both in private life and community life there and around New Paris, Ohio, but also in the Ohio State House, in both the legislature and the state Senate. He saw political engagement and involvement as crucial to his work as a preacher of the gospel. I think his story is far too little known, but again, he didn't publish. And as you've probably heard before, and you'll hear again in this class, we disciples don't have bishops, at least in our first century, we have editors. And it's true, being an editor made you somebody. It gave you a certain place of authority. And Purviance never pursued that. He pursued the local church and activity in politics to speak up for the basic human rights and Christian values that he believed in. So I invite you to think about David Purviance. And then there's Sarah Lou Bostick. Now, many of you might have heard of Carolyn Neville Pear and the 1874 development of the Christian Women's Board of Missions, that it was the women of the church who saw a need to go into the mission field, beyond the local, beyond even the state, and out into the world to share the gospel. And the women were so successful, within a couple of years, the men said, hey, we want in on this. But it was the women who were the pioneers and who carried the load, both in terms of the fundraising and the organizational structure. But it was just a few years after that got started that Sarah Lou Bostick said, I want to do this for African-American women. Now, then in Kentucky and so much of the United States, North and South, our movement was segregated. Our voice for those who had been marginalized tended to not speak very clearly, if at all. And I root a lot of that back in Alexander Campbell's concern that in the 1840s and 1850s, if we spoke up too loudly about abolitionism, we might divide the church, which happened anyhow. But it didn't happen on Campbell's watch, and that's what he was concerned about. And though privately he spoke against slavery, personally, again, he inherited slaves, owned them at one time, which Cardwell and Fox's book starkly points out in its earliest chapters, making that an important statement, which is easy for disciples historians to overlook. Both Stone and Alexander Campbell owned slaves, unwillingly, well, but they did. And then their voices on behalf of abolition and freedom and emancipation were largely silent. So we had mostly segregated institutions, certainly well into the 1800s and definitely on through the 1900s too, but we'll get on to that. But Sarah Lou Bostick decides that there are enough African-American women in African-American churches of disciples of Christ variety that there should be a mission movement for them. And so she went out and preached and taught and organized in the 1880s and 1890s. I can't imagine the challenges she faced simply in traveling and finding lodgings and getting a hearing, but she organized African-American women in the Disciples of Christ to support missions. And in 1892, she's the first African-American woman to be ordained in our tradition, as far as we know. And that's a part of our history too. I have to note that because certainly anytime, at least before, say, the 1960s, a local church might have done, could there have been someone, an African-American woman ordained by a local church, and it just never got trumpeted abroad, not published in a periodical, and we didn't have any central office to speak of? It's possible. But I think it's fair to say that formally and officially, Sarah Lou Bostick was the first African-American woman to be ordained in our tradition in 1892. And yet, for so many, even people who know a lot about our history, she's an unfamiliar name, let alone the work that she did, which is still blessing our church today. So David Purviance, Sarah Lou Bostick, both new centers for us to imagine standing in and looking at the mission field and the world around the church, and perhaps seeing it differently from. But my third and last, Myrtle Park, who later will marry and become Myrtle Park Storm, a small and in ordinary circumstances, quiet woman who many people before me have pointed out would be surprised by when she stepped into the pulpit, and she could storm heaven with her prayers, and she could kick up a storm with the congregation as she preached the word. And she preached widely and broadly all over Illinois. Now, she did travel later in life. She got to, I think, a couple of world conventions. She was interested in the wider movement of the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, as it was becoming, although she died not long before restructure took place. Passed away in 1965. But she was a parish minister. But a few things that are fascinating to me about Myrtle Park Storm and why I want you to hear her story. She went to Eureka College, started there as a first-year student in 1904, and very quickly shows up in various periodicals as filling pulpits in the area around Eureka at the age of 19 and 20. And in 1908, when she graduates, as was very often the custom at places like Bethany and down in Lexington and certainly at Eureka, the young men who were studying for the ministry would be ordained in a service often on the same day as the graduation ceremony, one at the college and then the other at the church in the street. In 1908, Myrtle Park, not quite 22 years old, graduates and is ordained. Now, she's not the first woman ordained in the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, not even in Illinois, but she's still a pioneer. She is an early woman to be ordained, and she serves in a variety of churches after some stretch of time as a traveling evangelist. Perhaps the novelty of a woman, powerful speaker, gave her an opportunity to pursue a sort of career that way, but she served in half a dozen different congregations as a parish minister, and that's where her impact was the greatest, and that's where so many in Illinois over the last 50 years would hear her name and smile and tell their stories about Myrtle Park Storm. Why do I think she's a person around which we could find a different sort of center? Well, I have to be personal about this and say, well, Myrtle Park Storm was the pastor through the World War II years in Kansas, Illinois, which is the town where my mother was born and raised. And after World War II, and when my mother was very young, she was very sick and spent the better part of the next couple of years in a hospital almost an hour north of that town. And neither her mother or father could really go to visit her, but every week, sometimes twice a week, Myrtle Park Storm, the pastor at First Christian Church, Kansas, Illinois, would come up to visit Rose Walton. And my mom never forgot that. And the lessons she learned about preaching and teaching and faith and struggle and survival, well, she honored Myrtle Park Storm. In fact, when it came time for her to get married in 1958, she asked of the brand new minister who had just shown up if she could ask Myrtle to come back and marry her. And he consented, and Myrtle did, came out of retirement. And she's the minister who baptized my mother, married my parents, and who taught my mother a faith which my mother taught me. So just for Jeff Gill, Myrtle Park Storm is at the center of my understanding of what it means to be a minister in the Disciples of Christ. And she is, in a sense, at the heart of my faith, even though I never met her in the flesh. David Purviance, a different sort of founder. Sarah Lou Bostic, one of those builder figures that we don't know enough about, perhaps because she served a population that, again, didn't leave as much of a mark in the written record, or at least those that were lifted up and pushed forward in seminary and in other training. And Myrtle Park Storm, because I think all of us have a Myrtle Park Storm. Someone whose faith shaped ours, maybe not even directly, but through our heritage and our history. And it's good to be aware of that history and how it shapes us and who we are and how we communicate the faith then on out to others. So that's my exercise in decentering this week. I pray you delve into the readings with a good will, that you get through all of them, and that we'll have a good discussion here in week 1 on the message board, and that I continue to figure out how to make Canvas work. So as we all work on these projects together, God bless you, and you'll see me again next Sunday with a video for week 2.